I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary. Because tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. It's going to bring our country's businesses back.
Like many other small and medium-sized manufacturers I've talked to this year, Alpha USA is having problems with Trump's tariffs.
We're faced with an existential threat with this. Unless we get some relief or unless we can pass these costs on, our company and many companies like us probably won't exist by the end of next year.
Donald Trump promised that record-high tariffs would bring American manufacturing roaring back. He said it would mean more factories, more jobs, and fewer foreign dependencies. But here's what actually happened in 2025. The U.S. auto industry is being strangled by the very tariffs meant to save it, and the cracks are showing faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. While Trump celebrates economic nationalism, it's Canada, steady, predictable Canada, that suddenly looks like the last anchor of stability in a North American supply chain now shaking from within. A new report from Detroit lays out the situation bluntly. At a small but essential manufacturing plant in Livonia, Michigan, Alpha USA is paying over $1 million in tariffs this year alone, with another $250,000 added every month. The company's entire business model is being rewritten by Trump's Section 232 and IEEPA tariffs, duties applied not to punish China or Mexico, but to imports the U.S. itself still relies on. Inside the factory, workers hold up simple metal fasteners, the kind that keep brake lines and wiring harnesses attached to a vehicle frame. Half the components they need still come from overseas. Domestic production cannot fill the gap, and the tariffs are hitting faster than any reshoring strategy can replace those imports. Meanwhile, the nationwide picture is no better. Despite months of promises about bringing jobs back, the U.S. has lost tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs this year. The auto sector alone is down more than 15,000. Trump's allies point to Stellantis restoring a shift at its Warren truck plant, calling it proof that tariffs move the needle. Yet the same plant endured mass layoffs only a year earlier, and even now the company's plans look more like political messaging than long-term industrial strategy. A temporary job shift is not a recovery. It is a reaction, and a fragile one. This moment captures a deeper truth. North America's auto supply chain is not three separate national systems. It is one integrated organism. When one artery is cut, the entire body weakens. Trump built his tariff argument on a simple idea. Make imported parts expensive enough, and companies will start producing everything at home. But the auto sector has spent decades growing across borders. A single component often crosses Canada-US or US-Mexico borders multiple times before final assembly. You cannot turn that system into an autarky overnight. You cannot nationalize a continental supply chain by shouting, "Build it here." And when tariffs were imposed, the first casualties were not foreign suppliers, they were American ones. At Alpha USA, a part that used to cost a dime now costs 15 cents. That difference may sound small, but multiply it across thousands of components, dozens of platforms, and millions of vehicles, and suddenly the entire cost base of American manufacturing rises. This is why U.S. car prices continue to move upward. It is not because of Canada. It is not because of Mexico. It is because Washington has chosen to tax its own supply chain into sclerosis. The irony cuts even deeper. The United States does not yet have the domestic capacity to replace the parts it is taxing. Even the Michigan fastener plant featured in the report still depends on imported nuts from Taiwan because there is no immediate domestic substitute. Trump's promise that America could build everything here in a single presidential term was never realistic, and the factories now caught between higher tariffs and limited domestic alternatives are paying the price. Canada, in contrast, remains a stable, integrated partner, technologically aligned, geographically close, and operating under world-class standards. No executive in the sector seriously views Canada as a security threat, despite Trump's rhetoric. In fact, Ottawa is the one partner that doesn't play games with supply chain rules. The U.S. may be the biggest economy in North America, but Canada is the one providing predictability. The Stellantis case is a perfect illustration of how politics, not economics, is now shaping U.S. auto employment. After Trump's new tariff announcement, Stellantis abruptly restored a shift at its Warren plant. Local union leaders celebrated, the White House claimed victory, and the press momentarily treated the move as evidence of a manufacturing renaissance. But look closely. This very same facility laid off more than 1,600 workers not long ago. There was no major new investment tied to the shift's return, and the supply chain feeding that plant remains stressed, fragile, and more expensive than before. The job exists because the tariff pressure exists. Remove the pressure or let the costs climb any higher, and the job disappears again. This is what analysts now call a political job, a job created to satisfy a talking point, not a growth strategy. Political jobs cannot sustain a regional economy, they don't attract new capital, and they don't survive downturns. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side of the border, Prime Minister Mark Carney continues to emphasize long-term planning, regulatory stability, predictable investment incentives, and rule-based frameworks. Carney's message is simple and consistent. We remain a stable, open, and reliable trading partner. That is exactly what global automakers want: stability, not tariff roulette.
Since returning to office, Trump has raised tariffs not only on China, but on Canada, Mexico, the EU, and even allies such as South Korea. The pattern is clear. Washington is isolating itself at the precise moment global supply chains are reorganizing. German auto exports to the U.S. have dropped sharply. Ford is canceling EV investments and absorbing multi-billion-dollar charges, and American consumers are paying more for vehicles while getting fewer choices. Canada, meanwhile, has played the long game. Ottawa has deployed targeted tax credits, opened new trade corridors in Asia, and strengthened industrial partnerships with South Korea, Japan, and the EU. Where the U.S. oscillates between confrontation and improvisation, Canada keeps presenting itself as the calm, grown-up counterpart, the partner companies can rely on during a turbulent decade. This matters because the future of the auto industry is globally competitive. China's dominance in EVs and batteries is still expanding. North America cannot afford to waste energy fighting itself. And yet, Trump's tariff policy does exactly that. It turns allies into suspects, partners into rivals, and shared opportunity into internal fragmentation. Trump promised that tariffs would restore American industrial greatness. Instead, they have revealed how deeply the U.S. depends on the continental supply chain it is now disrupting. Small suppliers are suffocating, automakers are hesitating, workers are caught in a policy whiplash that produces headlines one month and layoffs the next. Canada, on the other hand, is positioning itself as the steady hand, the reliable anchor in a region struggling to find its economic footing. And as the 2026 CUSMA review approaches, the fundamental question is becoming unavoidable. Will North America rebuild its shared advantage, or will Washington continue breaking the system in pursuit of political theater? Because one truth is already clear: Canada cannot stabilize the auto ecosystem alone, but the United States cannot stabilize it without Canada.
This is really a catalytic moment for Canada and for our government, and I say that because we've got a Prime Minister who has brought the importance of the Arctic and sovereignty that is not recognized by countries like Russia and our friends, the United States.
I think it's about time Canada government need to focus on what are the beneficial for Canada. It's Arctic. It's that one particular area. This particular project is the one that could shovel ready in 2026.
Canada just made the boldest northern move in a generation. After decades of talking about Arctic sovereignty, decades of warning about foreign interest in the Northwest Passage, and decades of letting others develop while we stood still, Nunavut's Inuit leadership has stepped forward with something transformative. A fully permitted, community-backed deep-sea port at Qikiqtarjuaq that is ready to begin construction as early as spring 2026. At a moment when the United States is distracted by President Donald Trump's tariff battles, Russia is expanding its northern military infrastructure, and China is quietly investing across the circumpolar world, Canada is finally stepping into the arena, and it's doing so in the one place where presence is power, the Arctic. This port is not just an infrastructure project, it is Canada deciding, at long last, to take the North seriously. The recent press conference brought together Qikiqtaaluk Corporation, the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, and business leaders like John Risley to deliver a single, unmistakable message to Ottawa. The port is ready to go, and Canada needs to move with it. For more than 15 years, this project has been studied, reviewed, and analyzed. It has passed environmental assessments. It has earned full community approval. The location sits next to one of the richest turbot fishing grounds in the country. Yet, because Nunavut has no deep-water port, ships harvesting from Nunavut waters are forced to unload in Greenland or in far-off southern jurisdictions. Every trip that ends outside the territory drains at least $1 million in direct value, revenue that leaves the region before it ever has a chance to support local jobs or local development. The port site already has a 3,800-foot airstrip that can be extended into a tactical base. Defense officials have expressed interest because traffic in the Davis Strait is rising, and Canada lacks permanent infrastructure in the area. And with Northwest Passage shipping activity expected to increase over the next decade, Qikiqtarjuaq sits at the gateway of a corridor that global powers are watching very closely. The project's cost has risen to approximately $350 million for Phase 1, with just over $53 million already secured. But what matters most is this: the port is shovel-ready, fully permitted, and capable of beginning construction in the spring of 2026, provided Ottawa steps forward as a partner, whether through Coast Guard presence, defense tenancy, or national infrastructure funding. This moment is not a plea. It is a challenge to the federal government to finally match the ambition of the communities that live in the North. For years, Canada has watched other Arctic states build ports, runways, military bases, and research hubs, while we hesitated. Russia constructed an entire chain of northern ports. Norway equipped its far north region with modern deep-water facilities. China declared a polar Silk Road and made long-term investments in pre-Arctic logistics. Even the United States, despite its own slow pace, has at least moved forward on upgrading northern military infrastructure. Meanwhile, Canada mostly held press conferences. Nunavut's leaders captured the problem perfectly when they said Canada had nothing in the Arctic compared to its peers. This port is the moment the country stops being the silent Arctic nation, the one with the longest coastline but the least infrastructure, and starts being a real participant in northern geopolitics. Prime Minister Mark Carney has already signaled that the Arctic will become a central pillar of Canada's nation-building agenda. Reuters recently reported that his government plans to expand Arctic presence with new year-round operations and a long-term security commitment. Unlike previous administrations that focused on symbolic gestures, Carney views Arctic infrastructure as a structural investment, something permanent, something strategic, something that strengthens Canada for decades, not election cycles. The Qikiqtarjuaq port aligns perfectly with this new doctrine. It is Indigenous-led, it is economically sound, and it is geographically irreplaceable.
What makes this project even more powerful is who is leading it. This is not a Southern corporation imposing a project from outside. It is driven by Inuit organizations, Qikiqtaaluk Corporation and the Qikiqtani Inuit Association, who understand the land, the waters, and the long-term economic needs of the region. When northern communities take ownership, projects gain legitimacy. Environmental oversight is stronger, benefits stay in the region, and the work is grounded in stewardship rather than extraction. Canada's sovereignty is always strongest when Indigenous leadership is at the center. This port proves that point.
Right now, Nunavut's fishing industry produces enormous value, but almost all of that value leaves immediately because the territory has nowhere to unload, process, or ship catch. By forcing vessels to offload outside Nunavut, Canada effectively exports jobs, GDP, and tax revenue before it ever touches Inuit communities. A functioning deep-sea port changes everything. Fisheries can unload at home. Processing can happen in the region. Tourism can flourish with proper docking capacity. Marine services and shipping logistics can finally exist. For the first time, Nunavut can keep the wealth that comes from its own waters. This is economic sovereignty as much as geographic sovereignty.
The United States is not paying attention to the Arctic. Under Trump's second administration, Washington is consumed by tariff wars, legal challenges, and corporate pushback. Arctic infrastructure is nowhere near the top of America's priority list. That creates a rare strategic opening. Canada can build, quietly, decisively, while the U.S. is distracted. For once, Canadian sovereignty is not being overshadowed by American power. Instead, Canada is seizing the initiative.
NATO has been demanding stronger Arctic infrastructure from Canada for years. A deep seaport capable of hosting Coast Guard vessels, naval ships, tactical aircraft, and search and rescue operations gives Canada exactly the credibility it has been missing. This project doesn't just strengthen northern communities, it strengthens Canada's standing in the alliance.
The most powerful part of this project is not the concrete or the cranes or the dollars. It is the shift in mindset. For too long, Canada treated the North as something distant, expensive, and symbolic. Now the country is treating it as the center of future strategy, economic, military, environmental, and national. This port is the first chapter of a new Arctic era.
The Qikiqtarjuaq Deep Sea Port is not a proposal. It is not a concept. It is a project ready to break ground in spring 2026. If Ottawa steps forward, Canada will enter the next decade not as a bystander in the Arctic, but as a builder, a leader, and a nation investing in its longest coastline. The countdown has started. Now the question is simple. Will Canada meet it?
Tech stocks represent almost half of the value of all American stocks. And American stocks, by value, represent more than half of all stocks on the planet. Whoa! Are we putting too much money into this? Is the AI bubble about to burst?
Here's the truth no one in Washington wants to say out loud. If the US AI bubble pops, it won't just take down Silicon Valley, it could send shockwaves through the entire American economy. And at a moment when President Donald Trump is betting his second-term economic story on soaring tech valuations and AI hype, Canada is quietly building something far more durable. Real power, real resources, real national sovereignty.
Stocks and AI, because, and this is crazy, more than a third of stock value on America's main stock index, the S&P 500, comes from just 7 tech companies, all heavily invested in AI.
CBC's investigation recently posed a blunt, almost unsettling question. If the AI bubble pops, will the whole U.S. economy go with it? The concern isn't simply academic. Over the last 3 years, since the launch of GPT 3.50, American markets have been climbing one monumental wave. But a closer look reveals that nearly 1/3 of the entire S&P 500's value now comes from just 7 companies, almost all riding the AI surge. NVIDIA has become the face of this concentration. Its chips power roughly 90% of the world's AI systems, its valuation has skyrocketed past several $1 trillion, and its influence is so dominant that its stock performance alone can move global markets. But behind the scenes, the company has been engaging in what analysts call circular investments, pouring pouring billions into AI firms that then use that money to turn around and buy NVIDIA's chips. Goldman Sachs now estimates that up to 15% of NVIDIA's sales next year could come from this closed financial loop. Meanwhile, American tech giants have been borrowing heavily, issuing record volumes of corporate bonds to keep up with the exorbitant costs of new data centers, facilities that, according to recent reporting, now cost more to build than all other U.S. manufacturing projects combined. These centers require staggering amounts of electricity, cooling, land, and infrastructure, yet many of the companies behind them continue to lose money at breathtaking speed. OpenAI, for example, is forecasted to lose more than $70 billion over the next 3 years, even as its valuation approaches $500 billion. All of this raises a simple, uncomfortable question. How long can the U.S. economy ride a wave built almost entirely on expectations rather than profits?
President Trump routinely points to the stock market as proof of American strength. But peel back the surface and it becomes clear that the market's resilience depends overwhelmingly on a handful of tech giants. If AI spending slows or investor optimism fades, the repercussions will be felt across the entire economy. This isn't just about a volatile sector. It's about the foundational role that tech now plays in America's financial system. As one analyst put it, tech stocks aren't just driving the market, they are the market. The AI sector also carries a paradox that traditional industries don't face. The more customers these companies gain, the more money they lose. Every query costs energy. Every model update requires thousands of new chips. Every training run demands massive capital outlays. The entire industry is built on the assumption that profitability will eventually arrive, somehow, someday, through a breakthrough in automation or artificial general intelligence. But investors are beginning to wonder how long they can subsidize the promise.
This is where Canada's story becomes compelling. While the United States doubles down on AI speculation, Canada is grounding its future in assets that generate lasting value. Ottawa is expanding a clean energy grid that already sits at 85% emissions-free. Provinces are building high-voltage transmission links to move power across regions. New LNG corridors are emerging on both coasts. Critical mineral mines are being fast-tracked through the Major Projects Office. And Canada is deepening partnerships across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe to diversify trade away from an increasingly unpredictable United States. This contrast could not be sharper. The U.S. AI sector consumes electricity at a pace that utilities across multiple states now warn is unsustainable. Some regions are facing energy shortages, construction delays, and grid instability. Canada, by comparison, has decades of surplus hydroelectricity, vast potential for wind and nuclear, and the ability to export power-intensive products the world actually needs. When Prime Minister Mark Carney calls Canada an energy and resource superpower, it isn't rhetoric. It is a statement rooted in geography, engineering, and global demand.
There is a geopolitical dimension here that often gets overlooked. Trump's second-term strategy, his tariffs, his pressure on allies, his America First negotiations all hinge on the U.S. economy staying strong enough to absorb the blowback. But if the AI bubble even partially deflates, that leverage collapses. A 10% correction in tech could wipe out trillions in market value. A deeper drop would push the United States toward recession. And because tech makes up nearly half the value of American equities, the shock would cascade through pensions, banks, and global markets. Trump needs the AI surge to hold. He needs the Magnificent Seven to keep climbing. He needs investors to believe the future payoff will justify today's extraordinary spending. But the fundamentals tell a different story. AI models age quickly. Chips become obsolete within a few years, and the infrastructure decays faster than any traditional industry. That is not a stable foundation. It is a pressure point waiting for a trigger.
And this is where Canada's national confidence is rising. Canada's strength is rooted not in speculation, but in tangible value,
vast natural gas reserves, strategic mineral deposits, immense hydro capacity, emerging Arctic trade routes, and a clean power industrial base that companies around the world want to tap into. These are assets that don't burst or deflate because they aren't tied to investor psychology. They are tied to physical demand. While Trump leans on the Magnificent Seven, Canada is building coalitions with South Korea, the UAE, Asian nations, Japan, and the European Union. The U.S. is concentrating risk, Canada is distributing opportunity. If the American AI gamble falters, Canada becomes one of the safest, most stable, most energy-rich economies in the Western world, and the global market will notice.
There is an even deeper implication. If the AI bubble weakens, Trump's political model weakens with it. His tariff threats lose power. His economic narrative loses credibility. His ability to pressure allies diminishes. A market crash wouldn't just shake Wall Street, it would shake the geopolitical hierarchy of North America.
The question that will define the next decade isn't whether AI will change the world. It will. The question is whether the payoff arrives before the correction. If it arrives, the United States will soar. But if the correction hits first, America will face an economic shock unlike anything since 2008. Canada isn't waiting for that answer. It is building a resilient future now, one rooted in clean power, critical minerals, diversified trade, and real assets that don't evaporate when a bubble bursts. In a world obsessed with prediction, Canada is preparing for reality, and that may be the smartest move of all.